Boston in winter was both beautiful and brutal. A city wrapped in silver ice, where the air stung your cheeks and the wind didn't care how much rent you paid. The snow made everything quiet, but it also made everything harder. Cars groaned under frost, streetlights flickered against sleet, and even the Charles River looked frozen mid-thought. Aaliyah Brooks had learned how to keep her head down and her gloves on. She worked 12-hour shifts at Boston Medical, often walking home past midnight when the world was too cold to talk. Her small apartment in Dorchester wasn't much. A couch that squeaked, heating that came and went, and neighbors who argued about football like it was religion. But it was hers. She'd just finished another shift in the ER, where the word rest was more myth than fact. Her feet ached, her eyes stung, and her brain still replayed the night. A car crash, a panic attack, a baby born in the hallway because Boston traffic had frozen time. By the time she reached her apartment, her hands were shaking from the cold. She dug in her bag for her keys and realized too late she'd left them in her locker. "Perfect," she muttered, stamping her boots. From down the hall, a man's voice said, "Need help?" She turned and saw him, tall, bundled in a dark coat, standing outside the apartment across from hers. He had a white cane in one hand and a calm, unreadable expression. "Oh my God, you're new here," she said automatically. "Guilty," he said with a small smile. "Daniel." "Aaliyah," she replied. "And yes, I locked myself out like a genius. Do you need to call someone?" "I could," she sighed, "but my phone's dead. I might just sleep in the hallway and let life take me." He chuckled quietly. "You sound dramatic." "I like that. ER nurse. Comes with the trauma." There was something disarming about the way he smiled, like he could see her without seeing her. His eyes were light gray, distant but focused, like they were listening more than looking. He nodded toward his door. "You can wait inside while you figure it out. I make good coffee, allegedly." Normally, Aaliyah wasn't the type to walk into strangers' apartments, but the hallway felt like Antarctica and Daniel's voice carried a warmth she hadn't heard in weeks. "Fine," she said, "but if you're secretly an axe murderer, I'll haunt you." "Fair deal." Inside, his apartment was neat, minimalist, like someone who valued quiet. She noticed books stacked neatly by the window, a record player on the table, and a faint scent of cedar and coffee that he poured her a cup and handed it over carefully. "Careful," he said. "Hot." "You weren't kidding," she said after the first sip. "This is amazing. I told you. Best coffee in Boston." "Lies. You can't even see it," she teased. "Ah," he grinned, "but I can smell quality. And I pay too much for beans, so it has to be good." She laughed, something she hadn't done genuinely in a while. As the hours passed, she learned that Daniel was quiet, almost old-fashioned in how he spoke. He had the kind of calm that made you feel like the world had slowed down just for a second. He told her he'd lost his sight in an accident a few years ago, that he'd moved to Boston to start over. He didn't say from what, and she didn't ask. In return, she told him about the ER chaos, the patients who broke her heart, and the little moments that made it worth it. Like the kid who drew her a crayon picture after she saved his dad's life. By the time her locksmith showed up, it was past 2 a.m. "Thanks for not letting me freeze to death," she said as she stood at the door. "Anytime. It's my civic duty to prevent hallway hypothermia." She laughed softly. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Aaliyah." When she left, he stood there for a moment, listening to her footsteps fade down the hall. He hadn't realized until that night how much silence weighed when you were used to it. Over the next few weeks, they became accidental friends. She'd knock on his door with leftovers from the hospital cafeteria, don't judge. And he'd fix things for her. The flickering bulb, her squeaky cabinet, even her stubborn coffee machine. "You're spoiling me," she said one morning as he tinkered with the machine. "I like fixing things," he said. "Makes me feel useful." "You are useful," she said, softer than she meant to. He turned toward her, smiling slightly. "You're kind. And you're deflecting," she shot back, grinning. He laughed, a real laugh that made her realize how rare it was for him to let his guard down. Winter dragged on, and Boston only grew colder. But for Aaliyah, those evenings in Daniel's apartment became her favorite hours. She started to notice the little things about him. How he could tell when she was tired just by her footsteps, how his hands hesitated on objects like he was mapping their story, how he spoke gently but always listened sharply. Sometimes they'd sit in silence, the heater humming softly, both too comfortable to fill the quiet. One night, after another brutal shift, she came over with 2 takeout boxes. "Dinner," she said. "Nurse special, carbs and regrets." "Sounds gourmet," he said, smiling. She kicked off her shoes, flopped on his couch, and groaned. I think I've hit my compassion quota for the week. You, he teased. Never. She turned her head, studying him. You always sound like you know me better than you should. Maybe I just pay attention, he said. Something in the way he said it made her pulse skip. She looked away quickly, pretending to dig into her noodles. He leaned back. Can I tell you something? Sure. I didn't realize how lonely I'd gotten, he said quietly. Until you showed up that night. Her throat tightened. You and me both. They sat in silence for a while, snow tapping against the window. Then, softly, he asked, You ever feel like life skipped you somehow? Like everyone else is living and you're just watching, she finished. Every day. Yeah. Aaliyah smiled faintly. Guess we're both watching then. He smiled too, even though he couldn't see her expression. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. That night, after she left, Daniel sat for hours replaying her voice in his mind. Her laugh, her sigh, the way she said his name like she didn't know it was borrowed. Because Daniel wasn't just Daniel. He was Daniel Hayes, heir to one of Boston's biggest development empires. A man who'd lost everything when greed and betrayal turned family into enemies. The accident that took his sight wasn't entirely an accident. And when his so-called brother faked documents to claim Daniel's estate, the world believed he was dead. He had let them. Until Aaliyah. She didn't know who he was, and he liked it that way. Around her, he wasn't a name or a company or a lawsuit. He was just a man who fixed coffee machines and liked the sound of her laugh. But every time she said his name, a small part of him ached. Because one day she'd learn the truth, and he didn't know if she'd still look at him the same. One morning, he was sitting on the couch when she walked in, holding 2 coffees. You're up early, she said. I couldn't sleep. Something wrong? He hesitated. No, just thinking. Dangerous habit, she teased. He smiled faintly. What do you see when you look at me, Aaliyah? She blinked, surprised. What kind of question is that? Just answer. She studied him quietly. I see a man who's smart, quiet, and definitely not used to needing help. He chuckled. Helpless isn't always bad. Feels bad sometimes. He nodded slowly. Yeah, sometimes. She reached for the blanket beside him and sat down. You don't have to pretend you're fine, you know. I'm not pretending, he said softly. I'm just grateful. For what? For you. Aaliyah's breath caught slightly. Daniel, he turned his head toward her voice. I mean it. The room was quiet except for the sound of her heart thudding in her chest. She smiled faintly, trying to hide how much those 2 words hit her. You're impossible, she whispered. Yeah, he said, smiling. But you like it. She laughed softly, shaking her head. Outside, snow started to fall again, gentle, steady, endless. He could feel the warmth of her beside him, smell her shampoo, hear the smile in her breath. And in that quiet, something shifted. For the first time in years, Daniel Hayes, the man who'd lost everything, felt like he'd found home. Winter didn't end quietly that year. It melted slowly, like Boston was reluctant to let go of its sadness. The sidewalks were still coated in salt, the river half frozen, and people still hurried through the cold like they were running from something. Aaliyah and Daniel had fallen into a rhythm. Quiet dinners, long conversations, laughter that softened the edges of exhaustion. He had become her calm in the chaos, and she had become his reason to stay grounded. But peace has a way of attracting storms. It started one afternoon when she came home early from work. The door to Daniel's apartment was slightly open. Odd, since he always locked it. Inside, 2 men in suits were standing near the window, their voices low. Mr. Hayes, one of them said sharply, you can't keep hiding like this. The board is falling apart. Your brother is selling everything. Aaliyah froze. Daniel, Mr. Hayes? He was standing by the table, tense, his white cane in hand. I told you I'm done, he said flatly. I don't care what they're selling. You can't just disappear, Daniel. Boston still thinks you're dead. Her heart stopped. The men noticed her and fell silent. Daniel turned slowly toward the door. Aaliyah? She stepped forward, eyes wide. What's going on? He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Daniel Hayes? She said, voice trembling. As in Hayes Group? The Hayes that owns half of downtown. He sighed, shoulders dropping. It's not what it sounds like. It sounds like you lied, she said, voice breaking. The 2 men exchanged glances and quietly left. The door clicked shut, leaving the kind of silence that feels like a bruise. Daniel set down his cane. Aaliyah, please. How long? She asked. Since before I met you. So, all this time, the coffee, the late night talks, you were just pretending to be what? Normal? I wasn't pretending, he said quietly. I was normal with you. She shook her head. You don't get to say that. You had a whole life, money, power. And you let me think you were just some guy trying to start over. I was trying to start over, he said, voice breaking now. Because the old life nearly killed me. My family tried to take everything. They used me, then left me for dead. I needed to disappear. And I was what? Your cover story. No, he said, stepping closer. You were the only real thing I had. She looked at him, the man who'd become her safe place, and suddenly he felt like a stranger. I don't even know who you are, she whispered. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed soft. You know me better than anyone ever has. Yeah, well, she said, blinking hard. Maybe that's the problem. She left before he could answer. Boston in spring was cruel that way, beautiful but too quick to forget. The snow melted, the sky cleared, but Aaliyah felt stuck in winter. She threw herself into work, extra shifts, double hours, anything to drown out the ache. But she missed him, missed the sound of his laugh, the quiet way he listened, the warmth that had become home. Daniel didn't try to reach her. Not at first. He went silent again, retreating into the same loneliness he'd thought he'd escaped. Then, one morning, the news hit every screen in Boston. Hayes Group files lawsuit against fraudulent CEO, original heir returns. The photograph was him clean-shaven, in a tailored suit, standing at the courthouse steps with that same quiet strength she remembered. She turned off the TV. Her hands shook. Weeks passed. Then one Friday evening, her shift ended early. The hospital lobby was nearly empty, quiet except for the hum of the vending machine. She stepped outside and froze. There he was, waiting on the steps in a dark coat, cane in hand. Hey, he said softly. Her breath caught. You shouldn't be here. I had to see you. Why? To apologize again. Yes, he said simply. And to tell you the truth this time. She hesitated but didn't walk away. He took a slow breath. When I lost everything, I thought disappearing was the only way to survive. I didn't trust anyone, not even myself. Then I met you. You treated me like a person, not a story. You made me want to live again. Daniel, I know I hurt you. I know I lied. But I swear, Aaliyah, nothing I said to you was fake. You were the only thing that was real. Her throat tightened. You should have trusted me enough to tell me. I know, he said, voice cracking. And I've regretted it every day since. She looked at him, really looked. The man who'd once been broken now stood tall again. But the softness in his face was still there, the one she'd fallen for when he was just Daniel from next door. What do you want from me? She whispered. He smiled faintly. Just a chance to make things right. To see if the guy you met, the one who fixed your coffee machine, still has a place in your life. Aaliyah stared at him for a long moment. The city moved around them, cars honking, wind biting, people rushing past, but time between them stood still. Then she said quietly, I don't need a billionaire. I just needed you to be honest. I can do that now, he said. If you'll let me. She sighed, half laughing. You're impossible. Yeah, he said with a smile. But you like it. She laughed then, the same sound that had first made him feel alive again. Coffee, he asked softly. Only if you're buying. He grinned. Always. They walked side by side down the street, the city lights glowing against the thawed pavement. He reached for her hand, tentative, searching, and she didn't pull away. Spring in Boston felt different that year. The wind was still cold, but it carried something new, hope, forgiveness, and a love that had survived the storm. Daniel didn't need to see the world to know it was beautiful again. He could feel it, right there beside him. And as they turned the corner, her fingers tightening around his, he smiled. Because sometimes, even in a city buried under snow and silence, love finds a way to bloom again. 1 year later, Boston in late autumn looked different when you had something to stay for. The streets glowed gold with fallen leaves, the air crisp but kind, and the city, once heavy and cold, finally felt like home again. Aaliyah stood behind the counter of a small cafe tucked near Beacon Hill, laughing as a customer complained about the outrageous price of oat milk. The sign above the door read, The Second Cup, owned by Daniel and Aaliyah Hayes. Daniel sat at the corner table, laptop open, a soft jazz tune playing from the old record player they'd bought at a thrift shop. He still used his cane, though his sight had partially returned after months of treatment. Enough to see outlines, light, her smile, which was all he really cared about. He heard her moving toward him before he saw her, that familiar rhythm of steps he could recognize anywhere. "Stop working," she said, setting down 2 cups. "It's Saturday." "Technically," he said with a grin. "It's Saturday in my cafe." "Correction," she said, crossing her arms. "Our cafe." He laughed softly, nodding. "Right. Our cafe." She sat beside him, and for a moment they just watched the afternoon sunlight spill through the window. Boston buzzed outside, sirens, laughter, city sounds, but inside it was quiet, warm, peaceful. "I still can't believe this is our life," she said softly. "I can," he said, reaching for her hand. "You believed in it first." Aaliyah smiled, eyes glimmering. "You mean when you were fixing my coffee maker and pretending to be broke?" He chuckled. "Best mistake I ever made." She leaned over and kissed him. Slow, sure, the kind of kiss that felt like home. When they pulled apart, he said, "You realize this cafe only exists because your coffee was terrible." She laughed. "Yeah, well, guess I needed a billionaire barista." He grinned. "Guess I needed a nurse who'd remind me what living felt like." Outside, the city was starting to snow again, the first flakes of the season falling gently against the glass. Daniel turned toward the window and smiled. Once, snow had meant loneliness and endings. Now, it meant everything beginning again.